Hello everyone, my name is Sweetnam and I am Fellowship and Membership Engagement Manager for the International Institute for Conservation. I'm very excited to be able to present our paper today, Disruptive Conservation in the Material Transmission of Past to Future.
And hi, I'm Jane Henderson. I'm a professor and teach conservation at Cardiff University. I'm also currently Secretary General of the International Institute for Conservation. Ellie and I are both trained conservators, and so we're using conservation as one of the practices in museums and heritage organisations as a focus for today's paper and to illustrate our examples. Now, we in our work deal very much with objects in museums. And when those objects move into the museums, the location and nature of their power shifts. On the one hand, you can imagine the objects as losing power. For example, people talk about taking Confederate statues out of the public square as an attempt to neutralize them. And the symbolic status of the statue is mediated in the public space by the power of the museum. But what's interesting, I think, is that by implication, therefore, the power and status of the museum and the people who represent the museum grows. Now, this is the current situation, but looking back when an object was collected during an imperial conquest, then the transference was not just a matter of the location of the art or cultural, it was very much symbolic of the destruction of one culture and the domination of another. So removing the power and association of things to a place is definitely a question intimately connected with colonialism. Next slide, please. In heritage conservation, conservation is the measures taken to extend the life of cultural heritage while strengthening the transmission of the significant heritage messages and values. So conservation is about basically practicing in the present with the intent of supporting the transmission of value from the past to the future. In most cases, conservation practice will involve actions that change the tangible manifestation of the museum object. And a challenge for those of us working in the heritage sector is to examine our practice both personally and on behalf of our wider professional community to consider both the tangible and intangible impacts of our work. Now, we care for scientific heritage, cultural collections and museums through active means where we intervene on an object, perhaps cleaning the surface or adding a repair, or by passive means where we change the environment around the object, perhaps to keep it drier or prevent pest attack. So active and passive conservation practices need to be examined. And what we want to examine is the idea of neutral actions by all museum professionals, but we're going to look particularly at the way that conservation is described, and in particular on the intent and an attempt to hide a conservator's actions on objects. Because we think that fundamentally the language and approach of conservation being described as benign or as neutral helps avoid really quite difficult examinations of how conservation helps to express the power of a museum. And I think it also may play a part in downplaying the violent stories, the violent stories that are sometimes associated with the objects that are now kept within them.
Museums must be viewed as political spaces as their histories and collections are based on the colonial practices of the West, and it is the choice of the actions taken by these institutions that continue to perpetuate this soft colonialism. Even something that can be considered the very foundation of the museum, that of keeping of the objects, symbolises a political act, and one that is often in conflict with the object's belief or origin. While museums may claim an objective or neutral stance on certain storylines and in their approach to our history, in practice this often takes a propagandist approach. This apparently neutral practice is exclusionary, but one that continues harmful stereotypes that materialise via colonialisation. When we begin to question the role of specific functions in the museum, such as conservation, we can encourage the creation of responses and outcomes that do not typically conform with the common current approaches. When objects move through spatio-temporal dimensions, it accumulates multiple values, significances, and relationships, and these intangible notions are continually shifting. When the object is placed in the glass case within the museum hall and a curator pins on the label, the object now becomes frozen. The material and contextual transition from past to future is halted within its present. The layers of time and interchanging values become concrete, and the object can now only exist to perform as the fixed definition allows. When we recognize objects as changeable entities, the role of conservation needs to be able to mold itself with these shifts and to be able to provide a framework that allows the object to perform as a whole. Our unexamined treatment methodologies and approaches, such as the use of a beige fill on a ceramic vessel, places the object back into the past and therefore creates a forgery of the original. These neutral interventions serve to present only a singular narrative of the object's true lifespan. It creates a false alignment for the viewer and as such continues to perpetuate these dangerous and harmful narratives of oppression. Conservators are expected to make tangible interventions on heritage objects to deliver a specific outcome. All of these decisions are linked to power and control and place us in a power struggle. It is these decisions which will affect whether an object will be on display, who has access to it, and what form it will take. Each of these choices is an exertion of power, and none of them are independent of the pathways by which the object arrived in our care. Traditionally, there's been a level of comfort in our neutrality in relation to wider political questions, and this has rendered our practices with choices that sound benign. The adhesive is selected for its reversibility. The gallery lights cater to average vision, and the collections of material things are boxed based on their physical properties alone. By removing ourselves from any discussion about stories of control, we have removed ourselves from responsibility and avoided spaces where we can be critical, both in action, such as in our gap fills, or in stance, as with the museum label. The implementation of neutral principles within our practice, such as reversibility and minimum intervention, that manifest themselves as silent, are designed to be as unobtrusive as possible, and so have become a synonym for good practice. This dishonesty of decision-making and intervention denies the viewer this truthful alignment. However, if we present the possibility of a hot pick mend on this dusky salmon ceramic, for example, this discernible mend can be seen as creating a more holistic and honest vessel for the viewer and allows the object to transcend the static parameters that have been placed upon it.
So there are many people in the museum and heritage sector and in conservation have acknowledged that conservation and museums are not neutral. And I think we've argued that conservators hold power, and that power provides us with an ability to uncover and expose the values of an object and how they've accumulated and been presented over time and how they're currently presented in the museum, and also to think through how they're being presented and understood in the future. Now, if we adopt, say, a gap fill that Ellie was describing in a very neutral tone, and we deploy such a neutral treatment without any critical thinking about how this might contribute to the redistribution of power, then I think we can become complicit in a kind of faux neutrality. So really what we would like to encourage is a little bit more reflective and reflexive practice about things like the continued use of apparently neutral vocabulary, about this minimal intervention and all these safe sounding concepts. And reversibility, another one that makes things sound safe. And there was a paper by Joelle Wickens and Anisha Gupta who've said that the fear of open conflict prevents participants from voicing different opinions and prioritizes those in power. So in other words, by not challenging, you are maintaining the status quo. So the actions of maintaining the status quo and maintaining the current practice, in a sense, it's very unchallenging to those who have retained and have the power, but perhaps a lot more, but doesn't actually then take on what's gone on in the past. So there's no representation of what went before. So institutions have the ability to engage audiences in a multitude of ways. For example, looking at musical instruments, it's not unusual for them to be played within museums. But some people have described such engagement as a destructive process. So you could look, for example, at playing a musical instrument and you will see a little bit of physical change. Something will wear, something will be gone. And for definite, you have lost something tangible. And this concept of destruction can be kind of weighed up against the intangible gain. So we're kind of trying to, we think that there's a zero-sum concept of destruction that it highlights a semantic uncertainty that, is a destruction a tangible matter only? Or if the loss of tangible is mediated by intangible gains, does the term destruction still apply to those similar physical changes? In this case, these intangible gains might be increased knowledge from hearing the instrument, introducing new audiences, and the sense of excitement. All of those things ought to feature in calculations of enhancement and challenge concepts of destruction. And the balance of choice between an object and the action of being played lies with the values of the decision maker who's deciding whether they can have that kind of access and that kind of use, and therefore to their biases. Many people will be familiar with the recent case with musician and classically taught flautist Lizzo, who was granted permission to play the crystal flute that once belonged to President James Madison. It could be argued that the very act of Lizzo playing this famous instrument, once owned by a founding father, is a very clear act of political symbolism. And this point doesn't seem to be missed by all the commentators on social media. And in this instance, the decision-making by the librarians, curators, and conservators could be seen as a choice between potential damage, that's tiny physical changes, versus an enhancement of meaning and intent. But it also highlights the redistribution of power between those being perceived as the establishment and their control, as represented by their custodianship of symbols of power. So any assessment of loss or damage must critically engage with both the tiny physical changes and against the ability for an audience to hear the instrument and be inspired, but also recognition that this inspiration is coming from the presence of African American women leading and enjoying the collections of Library of Congress. In other words, some of our intangible gain can be out with the cultural heritage per se and more located in the wider political environment. Because the environment within a museum is complex, and often the colonial legacies are the dominant ones. Lizzo playing the crystal flute was a powerful visual challenge to those legacies and demonstrates how the decisions of heritage professionals shape how objects move with the current times and the present, so not just reflecting the past, but also helping to shape our future. In this case, the institution acted with and against its power to push aside the status quo.
With 90 to 95% of African art housed in institutions such as the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it must be acknowledged that access in itself is a privilege and one that Western audiences need to realise is not always ours to hold. As we've stated previously, the keeping of objects of significance and immense value is the continuation of the dominant principles of colonialism, dominance, and power, and the continuum of this status quo. We must examine how our actions can reflect our choices and what those choices mean. Our neutral treatments are an example of the power of choice, and that by being neutral, both in action and mindset, translates to the fact that we are actually the dominant and institutionally complicit, which voids conservation from any form of neutrality. Disruptive conservation is a challenge via conservation practice to all that has gone before. It exists as a rejection of the cycle of attempted perfectionism within our practice, and so allows us to open objects to numerous possibilities. Our neutral vocabulary and treatments are this perpetuation of violence, and so must be explored further. While the authors have presented a hot pink mend as disruptive conservation in action, what disruptive conservation actually offers is a thinking process rather than a colour palette. A manifesto for disruptive conservation is neither a set nor a solid fact, but rather a guide that is to be interpreted by the conservator user. The manifesto is designed to fit well within the conservator user's working practice. You can use one, some, or all the points provided, and even adapt and develop it to suit the multifaceted contexts that exist within all of our work. Thank you for listening to our talk today.
Thank you.